The cruel gift. The Cross family ranch was a place where laughter often hid cruelty. That night, beneath the glow of oil lamps and the crackle of fiddles, the air reeked of wealth and arrogance. Nathaniel Cross, heir to the richest ranch in 3 counties, stood before the gathered crowd with a smirk that promised mischief. At his side, his wife Marjorie gleamed in silk, though her smile was sharp as a blade. The announcement came with a clap of his hands. "Tonight, in honor of tradition," Nathaniel drawled, "we present a gift, something rare, something unforgettable, for our quietest guest." His eyes landed on Thomas Hale, the cowboy who kept to the edges of every gathering, shoulders broad, hat brim shadowing his expression. Thomas shifted, suspicion hardening his jaw. He had endured enough of Nathaniel's pranks over the years, but the room's anticipation warned this would cut deeper. 2 men carried forward a chair, and upon it sat Eleanor Gracefield, Ellie, draped in white as though in mockery of a bride. Her hands were folded in her lap, her gaze cast down. She was silent, not by choice, but because silence was the shield she had learned after betrayal. Her legs, weakened and bound by braces, made her movements slow, and in this crowd of predators, weakness was blood in the water. Gasps rippled through the guests. Some chuckled uncomfortably. Others leaned forward, eager for spectacle. Nathaniel flourished his hand as though presenting a prize mare. "A bride for our quiet cowboy. Perfect, isn't she? Silent, obedient, and needing only a strong arm to keep her upright." Laughter followed, harsh and hollow. Ellie's cheeks burned crimson, but she did not cry. She had already spent too many nights drowning in tears when her former fiancé abandoned her for another woman, trading love for a dowry. She had learned, since that cruel day, that pain endured in silence carried its own dignity. Thomas rose slowly from his seat. His boots echoed across the wooden floor, each step deliberate, controlled. He stopped before Ellie, ignoring Nathaniel's smirk, ignoring the laughter. His eyes, dark as midnight fields, met hers only for a moment, but in that gaze she saw no pity, only recognition, like one scarred soul recognizing another. He turned to Nathaniel. "Cruelty doesn't make a man stronger. It makes him small." His voice was quiet but steady, and it silenced the room more effectively than a shout. Nathaniel's smirk faltered, but he masked it with a chuckle. "Take her then, Hale. Let everyone see how mercy weighs down even the toughest back." Thomas said nothing more. Instead, he bent, sliding one arm beneath Ellie's knees, the other behind her shoulders. Gasps filled the hall as he lifted her with ease, holding her as though she were not an object of mockery, but something fragile worth protecting. Ellie stiffened in his arms, her heart thudding painfully. She had been carried before, but always as a burden, a task. This felt different. His grip was firm yet careful, his breathing calm. The laughter faded behind them as he walked out into the cool night air, the door swinging shut on the Cross family's cruel spectacle. Beneath the open sky, the music muffled by distance, Ellie found her voice at last. Not in words, but in a trembling whisper. Why did you not refuse them?" Thomas adjusted his hold, setting her gently upon the rail of his wagon. He met her gaze again, steady, unflinching. "Because leaving you there would have been worse." Her throat tightened, though no tears fell. She wanted to ask why he cared, why he risked his place in a community that thrived on cruel laughter. But his silence, his refusal to explain further, told her what she needed to know. He was a man who had tasted betrayal himself. He carried scars unseen, and perhaps he recognized hers. The wagon creaked as he climbed up beside her, flicking the reins. The horses started forward, hooves clattering against the dirt road leading away from the ranch. Behind them, the laughter faded into memory. Ahead stretched miles of prairie, vast and quiet, where no one could sneer at her weakness. Ellie folded her hands tightly, her mind warring between shame and a fragile spark of hope. She had been given as a joke, a symbol of ruin. But the way Thomas had lifted her, without hesitation, without mockery, made her wonder if, perhaps, her story was not over. Thomas's eyes stayed on the horizon, his profile sharp against the stars. His silence was not emptiness but strength, a kind of vow unspoken. Ellie sensed that he carried burdens he would never name, wounds carved by betrayal as deep as her own. The prairie wind whispered through the grass, cool and clean. For the first time in many months, Ellie drew a breath without the weight of humiliation crushing her chest. Nathaniel had meant to laugh at her, to chain her dignity to scorn. Instead, she felt the faint stirring of something unexpected, something that frightened and comforted her at once. Safety, and perhaps, in time, love. Wounds beneath silence. Thomas Hale's ranch sat on the edge of the prairie, miles from the polished cruelty of the Cross estate. The land was rugged, stubborn, and honest, like its owner. He lived with few comforts, only the essentials required to endure hard work and solitude. Now, into that quiet world, he had brought Eleanor Gracefield. Ellie sat by the small hearth, the glow of firelight brushing across her pale features. Her hands rested in her lap, motionless, as though afraid to disturb the silence between them. Thomas busied himself with the kettle, pouring water into 2 tin cups. He did not ask if she wanted tea. He placed the cup before her with a nod, as though to say she deserved it without needing to beg. Ellie's lips trembled as she touched the cup. No one had served her with such simple respect in months. Since her illness, since her legs betrayed her, she had been treated as fragile glass, or, worse, as an unwanted burden. Her fiancé had abandoned her in favor of a woman who could dance and bear heirs without struggle. That betrayal had carved silence into her, leaving words trapped like birds in a cage. "Don't mind the quiet," Thomas said, finally breaking the stillness. His voice was deep, unhurried. "This house has lived with it a long time." Ellie lifted her gaze, studying him. His face was weathered not only by sun and wind, but by something heavier, something sorrowful. She wanted to ask what had carved those lines into him, but the weight of her own shame kept her silent. He sat opposite her, his cup untouched. "Nathaniel meant to make a fool of us both tonight." His eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. But cruelty says more about the man who gives it than the one who bears it. The word struck her, soft but firm, like a hand steadying her from fall. She lowered her gaze again, afraid he might see too much in her eyes. Fear, hope, and the deep wound of being unwanted. Hours passed. The fire dwindled, and Thomas showed her to a narrow room with a bed prepared. The blankets smelled of cedar and soap, not perfume or wealth, but they were clean, honest. As he helped her settle, she whispered her first words since leaving the Cross estate. Why do you not ask me to leave?" He hesitated, his hand lingering on the bedpost. "Because I know what it is to be left when you needed someone most." Ellie blinked. The confession was bare, unadorned, but it opened a window into him. She turned toward him, silently begging for more. Thomas straightened, his jaw tightening. "Years ago, I thought I had someone who cared. Marjorie Cross, before she became Nathaniel's wife." His voice was controlled, but the hurt bled through. "She said she loved me, said the land and the cattle were enough. But she wanted silk, silver, and a man who could promise her a house full of parties. So she chose him." The air thickened with unspoken pain. Ellie's chest ached, not with pity, but with recognition. She, too, had been discarded when love demanded endurance. Betrayal was a scar they both carried, though his was hidden behind silence and hers behind weakness. "I see," she whispered, her voice fragile but clear. "Then you know." "I know," he said simply. The fire in the hearth cracked. For a long time, neither spoke. Yet in that silence, Ellie felt less alone than she had in months. The following days unfolded with a rhythm both strange and comforting. Thomas rose before dawn, tending to cattle and fences. Ellie watched from the window, ashamed of her uselessness. But one afternoon, he returned with a pair of crutches he had fashioned from smooth wood. "You'll stand," he said, handing them to her. Her heart leapt in fear. I cannot." "You will." His tone was not harsh, but steady. leaving no room for doubt. No one here will call you broken. Her hand shook as she took the crutches. She tried, faltered, and nearly fell, but his hand steadied her. He did not laugh, did not sigh, did not pity, only waited until she tried again. Each step was agony, but each step was hers. That night, as she collapsed in a bed, tears slid silently down her cheeks. They were not of sorrow this time, but of something she had not felt in months, dignity. Thomas never spoke of it, but in his quiet watchfulness she saw the truth. He was fighting for her to see herself again, not as a discarded bride, but as a woman still capable of standing. And for the first time, Ellie allowed herself to wonder if the cruel joke Nathaniel had played might be the beginning of something neither he nor Marjorie could ever destroy. Confrontation and choice. The prairie morning was bright and windless, yet tension rode the air like a storm waiting to break. Ellie had begun to steady herself on the crutches Thomas built, each step clumsy but filled with stubborn will. Thomas watched from the doorway, arms crossed, quiet pride flickering in his eyes. It was then the distant rattle of wagon wheels cut across the stillness. Ellie's heart seized. Few visitors came this far from town, and none without purpose. The horses slowed, and the sight of polished lacquer on the cross carriage filled her with dread. Nathaniel and Marjorie stepped down, their clothes gleaming with the wealth that had bought them admiration in town. Nathaniel's grin was sharp as ever, but Marjorie's eyes slid past Thomas with something darker. Regret, perhaps, or longing. "Well, Hale," Nathaniel called, brushing dust from his coat. "I see you've not rid yourself of the gift we so kindly bestowed." His gaze flicked to Ellie, who stiffened but stood taller on her crutches. Thomas's jaw tightened. "She isn't yours to give." The words hung heavy in the air. Nathaniel laughed, though the sound carried an edge. "Careful. People will say the quiet cowboy has found voice." Ellie felt Nathaniel's malice keenly, but it was Marjorie who unsettled her most. The woman's gaze lingered on Thomas with a familiarity that made Ellie's stomach knot. It was not the gaze of a stranger. It was the gaze of a woman who once owned part of him. They entered the ranch house uninvited. Nathaniel prowled as though inspecting goods, while Marjorie trailed her fingers along the wooden furniture, eyes never leaving Thomas. "You live smaller than you deserve," she murmured, her voice smooth, intimate. Thomas ignored her, pouring water into tin cups as though her presence meant nothing. But Ellie, standing at the edge of the room, saw the subtle shift in his shoulders, the tension he could not entirely mask. Nathaniel leaned against the table, smirking. "You could have had better, Thomas. A woman who moves like a shadow of herself, who can barely walk. That's what you choose to defend." Ellie's breath caught. Shame flared, sharp and suffocating. Yet before despair could crush her, Thomas's voice cut through. "I didn't choose her because of what she can or can't do. I chose her because cruelty has no claim on her worth." The words, plain and steady, struck Ellie like a spark in darkness. She lowered her head to hide the tears threatening her eyes. Nathaniel's smile faltered. He pushed away from the table. "You'll regret this loyalty, Hale. She'll only weigh you down." He stalked toward the door, leaving Marjorie behind. The silence that followed was worse than his mockery. Marjorie stepped closer, her perfume cloying in the air. "You've grown harder," she whispered, eyes searching Thomas's face. "I made a mistake choosing Nathaniel. I see it now. You should not bury yourself with her. You could still have me." Ellie's chest tightened, her hands gripping the crutches until her knuckles blanched. The air seemed to thin around her, every sound drowned by the pounding of her heart. Thomas turned then, his expression carved from stone. "You had your choice, Marjorie. You chose silk over soil. Don't look back now and expect me to forget." Marjorie's lips parted, disbelief flashing across her features. For a moment she seemed smaller, stripped of the glamour wealth had given her. Then she gathered her shawl around her shoulders and swept from the room, her pride her only armor. The door slammed. Silence fell. Ellie trembled, caught between relief and fear. She had seen temptation laid bare, the shadow of betrayal hovering in the room. For a heartbeat she had believed he might falter, that she would be left once again. But Thomas stepped toward her, steady and certain. He placed one calloused hand over hers where it gripped the crutch. "I don't break vows," he said quietly. "Not the ones that matter." Her throat closed. Words failed her, but her tears told what her lips could not. For the first time, she believed him. Outside, the cross carriage rattled away, leaving dust in its wake. Inside, the air felt heavier yet cleaner, as though something long hidden had been dragged into the open and defeated. Ellie leaned against the crutch, her legs weak but her spirit steady. Nathaniel's cruelty, Marjorie's temptation, both had tested the fragile bond she shared with Thomas. And yet, against them both, he had chosen her. The prairie wind rattled the shutters, carrying with it a sense of change. Ellie drew a long, shuddering breath. For the first time since her betrayal months ago, she no longer felt like a discarded bride. She felt like a woman worth standing beside. Still, she knew Nathaniel was not finished. His pride would not allow defeat, and Marjorie's bitterness would fester. The storm had only begun. Redemption in love. The weeks that followed the cross's visit were thick with rumor. Word traveled fast through the small towns scattered across the prairie. Whispers of the cruel gift, of the cowboy who carried a silent bride from mockery into dignity. Some laughed still, but others began to wonder if the joke had turned against its tellers. Ellie felt the stares whenever Thomas brought her into town. She leaned on her crutches, her steps unsteady, but she met their gazes with a quiet strength. Where once she would have lowered her head, now she lifted her chin. Thomas walked at her side, neither shielding her nor parading her, simply present, as if her worth was self-evident. But Nathaniel Cross could not bear being made the subject of whispers. His pride, once fed by wealth and cruelty, festered with humiliation. One evening he arrived at the ranch unannounced, rage tightening every line of his face. "You think you've silenced me?" Nathaniel sneered, dismounting with a flourish. "You've turned my jest into your fable, Hale, but people forget quickly. They will remember what I choose for them to remember." Thomas stood in the doorway, calm but unyielding. "You've already told them what they need to know, Nathaniel. Your cruelty speaks louder than any story I could tell." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed, but before he could reply, the sound of hooves approached again. A rider galloped hard from town, shouting before he reached them. "The crosses. News from Ian. Marjorie's betrayal is out." The words landed like stones. Nathaniel paled, his bravado faltering. The rider explained breathlessly. Marjorie's indiscretions, whispered for months, had finally reached proof undeniable. A letter misplaced, an affair with a traveling merchant exposed. Ellie watched as Nathaniel's pride shattered before her eyes. He had mocked her for being discarded, humiliated her for being unwanted, yet now he stood abandoned by the very woman he had chosen over loyalty. Thomas's voice was low even. Cruelty always turns back on itself. Nathaniel swung onto his horse without another word, riding off into the night as though fleeing his own shame. Silence followed. The prairie stretched, wide and indifferent, the sky burning with stars. Ellie gripped her crutches, her heart pounding. She saw in Thomas not just a man who had rescued her, but one who had stood against temptation, who had chosen honor when betrayal had beckoned. Later, by the fire, Ellie spoke. Her voice was soft, but did not falter. "When he gave me to you, I thought I was a jest, something broken to laugh at." She paused, steadying her breath. "But you have given me back what I lost, dignity and hope." Thomas's eyes held hers, steady as the earth. "You were never a jest, Ellie. You were a woman wronged. I only helped you remember it." Her throat tightened, and for a moment she could not speak. She leaned forward, her hand trembling as it rested atop his. He did not pull away. Instead, he turned his hand, enclosing hers in the warmth of his palm. The fire cracked softly, shadows dancing across the walls. For the first time since her betrayal, Ellie felt not merely sheltered, but chosen. Not because of silence or weakness, but because of who she was beneath the scars. In the days that followed, townsfolk began to shift their whispers. Where once they mocked, now they murmured of resilience, of a cowboy and the bride who stood beside him in quiet strength. Nathaniel faded from their talk, his pride undone. Marjorie's name became a cautionary tale. One crisp morning, Ellie stood on the ranch porch. The prairie wind tugged at her hair as Thomas joined her. Without speaking, he offered his arm. She took it, steadying herself, and together they stepped down onto the grass. Each step was slow, deliberate, but they were hers. And beside her, he walked not as savior, but as partner. When they entered town that day, silence fell. No laughter, no cruel whispers, only the weight of recognition. People bowed their heads, not in mockery, but in quiet respect. Ellie lifted her chin. She was no longer the discarded bride of a cruel joke. She was the woman who had risen above it, lifted by the man who refused to betray what truly mattered. And though the prairie stretched wide and uncertain, she knew with certainty that the future would not be walked in silence alone.